Alright, what's up YouTube? Got another video for you today. And today I want to explain to you the difference between loaded and unloaded output voltage on an amp. So a lot of people, they'll set their gains on their amp and say, okay, the amp's clean up to, let's say 30 volts AC, and they'll set the gains there, hook up their speaker, and call it a day. But what people don't realize is when you actually hook up a speaker to the output of the amp, that voltage is going to sag. So essentially you're going to be clipping when you don't even realize it. So this is a Crossfire 600 watt monoblock. It does 600 at 1 ohm, and we're going to be running into a 1 ohm static load today. It is running off of a 80 amp power supply. The power supply's got more than enough power to push this thing into clipping, so don't have to worry about voltage drop or anything. So this would be a pretty good scenario to show you. So what we're going to do first is we're going to use our oscilloscope, and we're going to see what the clean output voltage is unloaded on this amp. Alright, so we got the amp powered up, and currently we have no load hooked up to it. So the ground for my load bank is still hooked up, but the positive is not. So there's no load. We have our oscilloscope probe on the output, and we're going to see how much voltage clean this amp puts out with no load. So you can see on the scope there, we got a 40 hertz tone playing. It's pretty low right now because the gain's all the way down. So we're going to turn the gain up and see where it clips. So that's hard clipping right there. So if we back it off, that's about clean. So you can see in the bottom left corner, 31.2 volts is our clean output with no load. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hook up our load bank, like I said, 1 ohm static, and we're going to see what the voltage is clean that we can get out of the amp with load hooked up. We have our 1 ohm static load hooked up to the amp. Amp is powered on. And I'll set the camera up here. You can see our 40 hertz sine wave is pretty low right now. So we'll turn it up and we'll see at what point it clips. So that's clipping. Back it off. 22.4 volts. I don't want to leave it like that for too long because that's hard on the amp, but 22.4 volts clean out of the amp with a load hooked up. So this kind of shows how if you set your gains in your vehicle at unloaded with, let's say up to 100 volts clean, that's what you get out of the amp, and you set it there, once you hook up a speaker, it's going to drop that down and you'll be clipping. So we'll dive in a little bit more right now, and I'll show you what causes that. We have the amp powered back up, and we have no load again. So I'm going to show you this. Now if you look at the scope, we have our yellow line, which that's your sine wave on the speaker outputs. As you can see, we got the 40 hertz tone playing. And then that purple line up there, that is your positive rail. So if you see down here, the positive rail on this amp with 14.4 volts of input is about 45 volts. So you're actually going to have two rails. So this is your positive rail, and you're going to have another one down here, which is going to be your negative rail, and that will be minus 45 volts. My scope's only a 2-channel, so I can only show you 2. But yeah, so what it does is swings the sine wave up to that point and down to your negative rail. So, like I said, the amp's unloaded right now, and we're going to see how it responds to turning the gain up. So you can see as we increase that gain, that purple line there is solid. It's not really moving. You can see once we start clipping, right there, that's when the sine wave hits that positive rail. So that's what clipping is. Clipping is your sine wave hitting your rail voltage. And obviously it can't go above that, so then it starts to square off right there. So as you can see, unloaded, the amp or the positive rail there stays perfectly solid, doesn't move. So now we're gonna hook a load up to it and show you how that responds. Alright, so we have our 1 ohm static load hooked back up to the amp, and we're playing our 40 hertz sine wave, and I'm going to show you exactly why you get less clean voltage out of an amp when the load's hooked up. So if I turn the gain up just a little bit here, you can see right now we got about 3 volts on the output, so not much. But even then, that positive rail, which was dead solid with no load, is now, you can now see it has pretty much a sine wave on it. And that's because the positive rail, or the output section, is pulling on that rail. So if I turn the amp up to clip point, and I'm going to pause the scope, so that's right into clipping. You can see the sine wave starting to cut off at the bottom there. You can see with no load, if you remember, the sine wave would swing all the way up to the positive rail and then back down, which it's still doing. However, that positive rail is not solid anymore. You can see it's dropping every time the output section pulls on that rail. So if I was able to show you the negative rail down there, you would see the same thing. Every time the sine wave would swing down to the negative cycle, it would pull on that rail as well. So this is exactly why you're going to get less clean voltage out of an amp when it's loaded. So I'm going to show you a couple other things here. I'm going to get some probes moved around and be right back. So I moved the one probe here, the yellow line, to our negative rail. So the purple line is going to be our positive, the yellow is going to be our negative. Right now the amp's off, and you can see the purple line, our positive rail, still has a little bit of voltage in it, it's slowly dropping. But if I turn the amp on, you'll see those jump up. So you can see that yellow line there has minus 44 volts on it, and the purple line has plus 45 volts on it. So if I play our sine wave again, before I do, essentially what you were seeing with the amp unloaded was that sine wave swinging up and down between those. So if I play our sine wave with the amp loaded, you can see how those rails behave. They get pretty nasty. So if you think about it this way, the gap you have between here is how much voltage you can put out of the amp, essentially. I'll turn it up and pause the scope again. So yeah, you can see here, if you remember, when this dips, that's when the sine wave swings up for its positive cycle, and then it swings down, and you can see the negative rail dip right there as well. So you can see those rails essentially come closer together when the amp's loaded, and makes it so that it puts out less voltage. So I'm going to back out here and kind of go over a couple things and show you why that is. So hopefully that gave you a bit of an idea as to why an amplifier is going to put out less clean voltage with a load hooked up versus unloaded. So if we look at this specific amp, right here, this area is your power supply section, which is essentially just a power inverter to create high voltage DC for the output section to use. So if you've been in audio for any length of time, you know that if you have a stock charging system in your vehicle and you hook up, let's say, a 1,000 watt amp, you're going to have voltage drop. Your headlights are going to dim, etc. Now, if you upgrade your alternator, add a lithium bank, upgrade wiring, then that voltage drop will be much better. So the power supply section of an amp, it's very similar, the principle it works upon, as to your charging system in your vehicle. So if you think about it this way, think of your transformer as your alternator and your rail caps as your lithium bank. And then obviously you have, all your traces in the board or jumpers or anything. That would be your wiring. Now, in this specific amp, sure, we have plus minus 45 volts on the rails, but the transformer or alternator and isn't big enough to hold that there. And your rail caps or lithium bank there isn't enough of it to kind of buffer that either. So that's why you get your voltage drop. Now, you could say the solution to that would be just add more transformers, add more rail caps, more MOSFETs, beef up the traces on the board. And that essentially is a lot of how these bigger amps operate and how they make their power. Now, if you look at a 10,000 watt amp, for example, that has a ton of transformers, ton of rail caps, it's still going to have rail sag. And that's just because it's trying to make more power. Another thing worth noting is the lower you wire an amp, the more rail sag you're going to have. So this is at 1 ohm static. If we were to wire it to half ohm, assuming the amp didn't blow up, then it would drop even harder than that. And that's the same reason, like if you double power in your vehicle, but don't upgrade your electrical system, your voltage is going to drop more. And it's the same thing. So technically, if you wire an amp low enough and it doesn't blow up, then you could end up making less power out of an amp just because those rails are sagging so hard. So the best solution to this is to set your gains a little more conservative. So let's say you have an amp that does 100 volts clean on the output unloaded. If you set it right at 100 volts, then you're going to be clipping once that amp is loaded. So maybe set it to 90 or 95. Another thing you can do is you could hook up a scope and play your system, play a sine wave through it while the amp is loaded and see how it's behaving there. With most modern amps, they have clip lights, and most of those are pretty good, so that's something you can pay attention to as well. But yeah, that'd kind of be the best solution, is just set your gains a little more conservative. Now, another thing worth noting is your rail voltage in most amps that are unregulated. This is an unregulated power supply. Therefore, the higher input voltage you have, the higher those rails are. And because of that, if you have voltage drop, so let's say you're charging at 14.4 and the base hits and you drop down to 13, your rails are going to drop because of that. Plus, you're going to have rail sag because of the load on the amp. So your rails are going to drop even harder. So if you set your gains clean at, let's say, specific to this amp, you set them to 32 volts, whatever, and then your voltage drops to 13 and you have it wired to 1 ohm, then you're going to be clipping really hard even though you thought you set your gains properly. So these are all things just to consider. Like I said, best solution, set the gains a little more conservative, make sure your electrical system is solid, not dropping really hard. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask away in the comments, and see you next time.